Now I'm going to answer probably one of my favorite questions, which is how do you make bread and butter pudding cake? Of course, that's not a regular typical question. It's not like how do you roast a chicken or a turkey. Bread and butter pudding cake is a very specific kind of recipe and formula, and it's certainly been one of my favorites. I can tell you now, before you go another minute into this video, that this is one of the neatest, tastiest, crowd-pleasing desserts you're ever going to get your eyes on. And I'm not trying to sell this to you. You make this dessert and you eat it and it will sell itself to you. And it doesn't cost that much. That makes it even better, you know. Most of the time when I'm cooking, I always figure out, well, what's this going to cost to make, and blah, blah, blah. So most of us are on some kind of a budget, and that would certainly include me. But from the point of view of the business of cooking, which is what I've done a lot of and still do, I'm always thinking what this costs and how much will this be sold for and so on. So anyway, getting past that story, I want to start by letting you know, too, that I have made thousands, I say the word thousands, of portions of this dessert and have served them. So I already know what's going to happen when you make this and give this to someone, and they're going to say, man, this is really great. Now, of course, everyone has their opinion, like they do about so many really common traditional dishes like bread pudding or stuffing for turkey and things like that. They have their opinions about how these things are made. I hear all the time, that apples and raisins are so you should be part of this. And yes, you could incorporate whatever you wanted into this. But I think the first time you delve into this recipe, make it the way I show it to you now, in accordance to the video and the written recipe, which you can click on. And try it like that first. So I'm going to give you an overview of this recipe first. First, this is a loaf of square sandwich bread and 10 eggs and 6 cups of milk and some sugar. And a little bit of vanilla. Or you can put whatever flavor you want. You can put a little Grand Marnier or Amaretto, whatever you want, but just go with the vanilla. That's my recommendation. So anyway, this is one of those recipes that appears to be extremely simple, and it is. As long as you know what you're doing, it's very simple. And so I would follow along with this recipe and make it exactly the way I show you, and it'll come out good. If you start doing a bunch of deviations on how you do this, you might find out you got a different recipe going here than the one I'm giving you today. So, bread and butter pudding cake, which is what I call this. Now, most people would just call this bread pudding. Now, I call it bread and butter pudding cake for a number of reasons. First, you can make it in a round pan. You can make it in a rectangle. You can make it in a square. You can make it in a triangle. You can make it in a heart-shaped pan. Any kind of pan you want to make it in, it doesn't matter. As long as you follow the ratio of the formula, which is 10 eggs to 6 cups of milk, you will get a certain texture in whatever kind of pan you bake it in. Keep in mind that you need something 1.5 inches deep minimum, and 1 3/4 is probably ideal in terms of the actual level of the custard in the pan when the pudding is baking. Now, I've referred to this recipe as bread flan because flan is just custard baked in typically in a little custard mold, you know. Well, this is lots of custard mixture baked in a mold with bread. So it's kind of bread flan a little bit. And especially since I recommend a caramel sauce, which I'm going to demonstrate for you. That's a separate video, but it's right here along with this one, next to me probably. The caramel in the flan, which flan has caramel often, usually, at least traditionally it does. So this is flan, bread, caramel. So it's got that flan kind of look and think to it. But it doesn't taste like flan. But there are two very important things about this dessert which you absolutely must understand. The first one is this is about the texture of how this dessert is made. This dessert will have a crispy, toasted top and a soft, spongy interior. This dessert is also not served cold. It doesn't mean it's served hot. ideally, you make it in the morning, you let it cool, you let it sit at room temperature, you serve it at room temperature. That's ideal. If you do have to refrigerate it, of course, you can heat it up slightly or at least temper it by not having it be cold, because cold changes the texture. Not to, I should say, to make a long story short, but it's already a long story that I'm telling, so I won't say that. But remember, when you refrigerate something like custard and bread, when it gets cold, it condenses and shrinks. That changes the texture. And when you heat it up, it expands it a little bit, and that changes the texture. So we're going to recommend that you eat this dessert at room temperature, made and served on the same day. All right, so this is the pan that we're going to put it in today, and we're going to bake it in a hot water bath. So I have this sitting in a recessed pan here, which ultimately is where it's going to end up. But I'm going to set this aside for a minute and just want you to get in on the toasting of the bread. First, this recipe calls for approximately 20 to 22 slices of thin sandwich bread. Not extra thin, just regular sandwich style bread that you can buy in a supermarket. And that's what I have in front of me here, one loaf of bread, okay? Now, I toasted these in advance already, and you're going to see me put this underneath the broiler in the oven and bring it out, and it's going to look like that, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time doing that, so I toasted a little bit in advance. But basically, you're going to take your whole unsalted butter that's soft, or what I would call ointment consistency, like toothpaste, if you will, and butter the bread lightly. Put it on a cookie sheet and slide it underneath the broiler and toast it. So I'm going to put this underneath the broiler right here and toast it, and I'm going to time-elapse that, and I'm going to bring you back when I'm taking it out. And then we're going to trim it all, assemble it into the pan, make the custard, pour it in, pop it in the oven. So first, toasting the bread. I got the broiler on high, and I'm going to keep an eye on it because you can burn it. And sometimes you got to take this piece of bread or that piece of bread out of there because it toasted, but a lot of the other ones didn't. So I may be doing a little bit of that before I bring you back in for the final removal of that pan from that oven. I'll be back right now. Okay, the toast, I just checked. It's getting really brown. I'm going to pull it out. And there we go. That's a hot pan. And here, let me switch that around a little bit. Okay, now, here, let's put this aside for a second. I'm not used to working in these domestic kitchens, but they do work. All right, now, I'm going to cool the bread off a little bit by just tilt it up on the sides of the pan. It gives the air a little chance to get underneath it. Okay, now we'll let that cool off. So meanwhile, I got a little bit of cool dip, but we're going to use all of this. First, trimming the bread. Let me see if I got this stuff in the way here. Let me get this out of the way so you can see what I'm doing here. I'll just stick that over there. Now, are you with me? All right. Stack up your bread, and we're going to cut all of the crusts off the bread. Now, you may want to feed them to your dog, feed them to the birds. You could even dry them out and make breadcrumbs out of them in the food processor if you wanted. But that's up to you. Now I'm going to cut the bread into triangles like that. I'm going to end up with a big pile of triangles here. 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the way, one of the things you can do when you're making a bread pudding is you can get this part done the day before. Cover your baking pan with the bread in it with plastic wrap and do that the night before so that you don't have to do this the day that you make the pudding if you want to schedule your time that way. Okay, let's get some more bread going here. Actually, if you really want to know the truth, my favorite place to cook is in somebody's house or my own house rather than the commercial environments that I have, which work very well if you're making commercial food. But I have this saying that the best meal you're ever going to have is in somebody's house because they got their heart and soul into it, and that's a big part of the whole eating process, you know. So anyway, I don't mind working in these little kitchens. They're fun. But I have this other saying that goes along with that, which is, and I don't want to get you too distracted from the bread pudding here, but it's always a sign of a weak cook that complains about his equipment. And God only knows that good food is made wherever it goes. It doesn't have to come out of a professional kitchen, that's for sure. Or how do you say it? Wherever it goes, there it is. All right. Almost got the bread trimmed. Cutting these all into triangles. Now what you don't want is you don't want the bread drying out so long before you cut it into the triangles like I am that it gets hard. Then when you start cutting the bread, it starts breaking up. You don't want to toast it that much and or dry it that much before you cut it and get it into the pan. The bread becomes inflexible and you need sometimes to shape it into the pan. I'm going to show you an example on how to assemble your bread in a round serving dish or baking dish rather than a rectangle like we're using today. I got a couple more pieces of bread over here if I need them, but we'll see. All right. Okay, let's say I want to show you the difference between this baking pan for making the bread pudding or this, which is really like a big saute pan. You can make your bread pudding in this saute pan if you wanted to, or any kind of cake pan. Just to show you, you don't need a special tool. You could set this on the buffet table for your dessert too, if you wanted to. It wouldn't be my first choice, but I'm trying to make the example for you that this is not about these molds or any of that, and you don't have to get all fussy about that. So let's say you were going to make it in a round one. All you'd have to do is overlap them in here like this, you see. And just keep going around and around and around. You have this really pretty little spiral kind of built into your mold, whichever mold you happen to have, okay? But we're not going to use that mold today, but I wanted to show you that because that's really effective. We're going to use this mold. And in this particular case, instead of there being a round pattern, we'll have a running pattern of rows of bread here. I'll show you what I mean. 1, 2, 3. And you just continue that. 1, 2, 3. That piece will maybe reserve. It's a little toasty on top. 1, 2. This one, somehow I didn't get the crust off of that one. Can't have that. Not to suggest it'll be bad if there's a little crust on it, but you don't want it to be tough on the top of the bread pudding when you're done. You see that little pattern I'm developing here, but I'm staying very systematic about the sequence. It's always 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Wherever you drop off, stop, you got to pick up right at that same spot again, see? That way you have this nice pattern. And when it's all said and done, and this particular dessert is done, you have this really homey, womsy looking, I hate to say this word, but it's kind of a grandma-ish looking thing, and it really looks nice. And when you make something like this for somebody, they love you more. Now let's say you think you don't have enough bread and you burnt some of your bread and you think it's too toasty. Just do that. That's not going to change anything. Other than giving me more to sweep up later after I'm done making this. Besides that, nothing. Now there are 22 pieces of bread, which was in that loaf, fit into this particular pan perfectly. And in the actual written recipe that you can click on if you want, I believe, if I'm not positive, it is a 10-inch by 2-inch round cake pan that the recipe calls for, okay? I am going to make it my business to get every piece of the 22-inch in here. Remember, the recipe formula is designed around 22 pieces of bread. Now, if you use 18, you're going to have less of a ratio of the custard to the bread, and it might be a little wet after it sets. You don't want that. You want the right amount of bread for the right amount of custard for this particular formula, okay? Okay, now, you see how I did that? I got a nice little pattern there. Now I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of sugar on the top. Not much. Remember, the tops of the points of the bread are going to be baking above the custard level in the oven. You put too much sugar on it, and the sugar has a tendency to burn faster in the oven. This is going to be baked at 400 degrees, and that's a fairly hot oven, all right? So don't put too much sugar on the top because you don't want the top of it burning. And same thing with the cinnamon, only this is not a burning issue. Just don't over cinnamon it. One of the things I do to prevent myself from shaking too much of anything out of a shaker is rather than shake it like this, I hold it and hit the bottom of it, and you have a little bit more control over how much cinnamon ends up coming out. So you just want a little scent of cinnamon throughout this. That's it. All right. So there's your toasted bread, trimmed, buttered, slightly cooled, put into the mold. Now, I'm going to time-elapse this. I'm going to be back now, right after I cut this off, because I'm going to clean this up and bring the rest of the ingredients out here for you right now. All right, I got it all cleaned up, and I had the final ingredients for the final assembly prior to the baking process, okay? Now, we're going to use 4 whole eggs first in a bowl. These are extra large. Keep in mind that all American recipes, unless otherwise specified, whenever it says eggs, it means extra large. So there's your 4 whole eggs. And now, for the 6 yolks, and this I would say would be the easiest and fastest way to separate your eggs. Let's see how fast I can do it. Then I can show you how fast it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6. All right. Let's get rid of that. All right. Now we've got 1½ cups of sugar. Boom, pre-measured. And we're going to throw a little bit of vanilla in here. You can throw the vanilla pure extract into the milk or into this, either way. And you can also use vanilla bean scraped out of the pot if you want, you know. And now you're going to mix the sugar and the egg yolk together. Just cream it a little bit. All right, that's good. Now I have the 6 cups of milk scalded. Now,
what does scalded mean, John?
I'm going to tell you. Now, first of all, what does scalded not mean? Scalded does not mean boiled, and scalded does not mean milk that's not hot. So you want to get the milk hot to the point at which it's steaming, like this milk is here. And you're going to see the steam come off it when I throw it into the egg yolks. Now, you want to add the scalded milk. Scalded means if you put your finger in it, you're going to burn it a little bit, okay? You want to add the scalded milk in a steady stream while you're whisking. Don't over whisk this, because all you're going to end up doing is making more foam on the top of this bowl. Can you come down here, please, Richard? More foam on the top of this bowl, and you don't want to pour all this foam on top of your pudding, so I'm going to remove this foam so I don't have a bunch of foam baked on top of my pudding, okay? Most of this is a bunch of air, which is basically, it's almost all air. All right. Now I've got what we would call an uncooked custard here in this bowl. I'm going to get rid of this. And we're going to bring our bread pudding pan that we just assembled back here. I've got a little bit of cinnamon sugar on there. Now, I told you earlier on in this video that the key to this recipe is going to be the final texture that the person who eats it is going to experience. Now, I said that the top of the toast was going to be crispy and the inside of the pudding would be soft and spongy. Now, you're not going to get your toast points crispy if you pour this custard all over it. So find one spot in the mold that you're pouring this custard into and pour it in only in that spot. Don't cover the bread with all that. Now, the bread's going to come up and float when I pour this in there. That's okay, let it float. Eventually, it will all be absorbed. The custard will be absorbed into the bread throughout the baking process, okay? And particularly the cooling process, too. Now, just real quick, I keep using this word custard, and I just want to clarify for you what that means. Custard is eggs and dairy product, typically cream, milk, half and half, something like this, that are cooked together. That's what makes it a custard. Egg and dairy cooked together. Now, there's different kinds of custards. Thick custard sauces. A pastry cream, for example, that like an eclair is filled with is a custard. And then there's a custard sauce. And then there's a baked custard, which is what we're doing now, okay? So I got a spot over here in the corner, and I'm going to pour my custard into it. And the bread is going to move around a little bit, and I don't care about that. But you'll notice how it's rising. The bread is now completely floating inside that container, okay? And your job now, look at that. You see how that moves around in there? It looks like there's way too much custard in here for what we got, but there is not. Now I'm going to show you how I'm going to do this. Now, whatever configuration you have to use for your particular molds and containers, is I'm using this pan because it's accommodating this perfectly, okay? So I'm going to set this in here, and we're going to bake this in the oven like this. I'm going to fill this with hot water. I'm going to fill it with hot water here. Normally I do it over here, but just so that you can see me do it, I'm doing it over here a little bit better. But typically you set this in your oven and fill it up right in the oven. Then you have to run around the kitchen sloshing water everywhere, okay? So I got water here that's boiling, all right? And let's see if I can do this without spilling water all over the place. I think I can. And one of the things you want to make sure you don't do is you don't want to put so much water in here that when you're moving it around, it starts sloshing around into your custard and diluting your solution, which is so perfect the way it is. So you don't want to get into the water inside there. Remember that. Okay, now I'm going to put this in a 400-degree oven, which I got set up over here now, and we're going to bake this thing off. And I'll show you when I'm about to take it out how to test it for doneness. There's a prescription in the recipe, of course, that tells you how long to bake it, but that's a specific guideline. You, of course, have to be able to know how to walk up and touch it, and I'm going to show you that when this is about done. So you'll know what you're touching and feeling for to determine the level of doneness. Okay, so let's get this in the oven now. And I'm going to put this in the lower part of the oven, okay? And I'm going to tell you why in a second. Let me do this so I don't burn myself first. Now, when I told you a second ago that you put the water in the oven, right now you could have your water in a pitcher and you could be pouring it in here. Then you don't have to move it around the kitchen. That's what I meant by that. So we're going to slide it in there. We're going to cook it in there. It's about an hour. Depends on your particular mold shape and size. It's about an hour. But the most important part is not how long does it take, but how do you test it to know when it's done, okay? And quickly back to why it's in the bottom of the oven. Again, I told you that the sugar has a tendency to cook more and possibly burn the bread on the top if you're not careful. Obviously, putting it on the top of the oven is going to make the top of the bread hotter because the top of the oven is the hottest part of the oven. So there's a couple of things. Let's say your oven is a little bit temperature crazy. What do you do if your bread starts getting really hot, but the custard isn't set? Well, one answer would be that you would turn it down, but then you may have to bake it twice as long, and you're not going to have the same result. So what I recommend, let's say your bread is burning, or not burning, but toasting the stuff that's protruding out above the level of the custard. If that's toasting more than you think it should be, or you want it to be, then what you can do is you can lay a piece of aluminum foil over the top of the bread, but still keep the whole container at that 400-degree temperature. That way you can have a constant temperature cooking the custard without cooking the tops of the bread anymore by covering it with the foil. So this is obviously going to be a time-elapse video, and I'm going to be back probably in about an hour, which is going to be right now, and I'm going to show you how to test it for doneness. And then I'm going to show you how to cool it, and there's a way in which you should set it elevated so it gets circulation on it at room temperature to cool. All right, so I'll be back in a little while. Right now, you're going to love this, by the way. Okay, that bread pudding has been in there about an hour and 15 minutes. It's time to take it out, and I checked it about 5 minutes ago, and I'm going to show you what I did. I thought that the tips of the bread had browned enough for me, and just like I recommended to you, I put a piece of foil on the top. Okay. Now I want you to zoom in down here, and I want you to notice that there's no waves of custard in here moving around. It's all kind of solid, but yet it's still soft. You see? See how that is? Now I'm going to take this carefully out of the pan, and I'm going to set it on this rack here so it'll cool. Okay, here, let's put it this way. There you go. Now you want to put it on a rack so it has a little bit of ventilation underneath it here, like it has here, so the air can circulate around it. And you want to let it cool at room temperature. And don't worry about these little black little points. These are fine. We're going to dust all of this with powdered sugar later on. And this is where the crispy part that I talked to you about comes into play. And it's going to be really nice. It turned out great. And now we're going to let it cool. We're going to time-elapse this cooling process. This is going to be cooling for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. And then I'm going to bring you back, and we're going to portion it up and put it on the plate with the caramel sauce, and you'll see how it looks and how it feels. Okay? So I'll see you in 4 or 5 hours right now. Okay? All right, the moment, I don't know about you all have been waiting for, but I have, and that's the completion of the bread pudding and getting it on the plate. And I want to point a couple things out to you about this bread pudding texture and all that. First, understand that this has been cooling at room temperature for about 4 to 4.5 hours. And it's right where it needs to be right now. Now you see them little black tips that are on that bread pudding? And it does look darling, doesn't it? Imagine this, of course, in any of your own casseroles that have flower prints on them and they're white ceramic and so on. So we're going to put a little powdered sugar on here. I want you to see that you don't have to have a dredger, which I have, of course, like 25 different kinds of dredgers, but I want you to see if you don't happen to have one, you can just take one of your little strainers and put your powdered sugar on there, okay? Now, that looks good. Now, you can cut it with a bread knife, or you can cut it with anything. I'm just going to cut off a little piece, and you can cut any size or shape piece that you want, of course. I'm going to cut a little square. Now the first piece that comes out of here, you usually want to use a rubber scraper to get it out if you want to keep it intact, okay? So that's how I'm going to get this piece out. And there we go. Now, what is important about this bread pudding? What makes this bread pudding so special. What makes this bread pudding so special is that you have the crispy top with the toast, and then you have this soft, spongy inside part here. See? This is very, very nice. Oh, I love this. And you can make them a little deeper. This is a nice depth also, okay? Now I'm going to put a little caramel sauce on there, and I'm going to really have to disappoint you with something because I asked my producer if I could do this. He said I could. I'm going to have a little bite of this because I want you to see what is the real reaction to eating this dessert, okay? So, here it goes. You ready? It's a warm caramel sauce now. You go to the caramel sauce icon, and it has a video on how to make it. You know, I know exactly why I have been making this dessert for the last 30 to 35 years. It is good. It is nice, and you're going to love it. Have a great time with this bread and butter pudding cake, and make it any shape and size you want. Just have a great time with it.